There are six things that matter to the socioeconomic advance or welfare of economies, countries. And being able to identify these six things is a valuable piece of equipment for economists, for sociologists, for politicians, for policymakers, and for investors. Being able to identify these six factors in current times arguably is even more valuable given the extraordinary uncertainty that is resident in the world. So what are the six factors that matter to socioeconomic advance? The first factor is that a country needs access to savings, and those savings need to be invested in productive ways. A second key ingredient is that the demographic structure of the population contributes to gains or advances in productivity. And the easiest way to measure this is by the shape of the population pyramid, that there are more younger people in a population than older people, the implication being that there are younger people going into the workforce, into the productive sector, and those people are greater in number than the people going into retirement. A third key attribute is the nature of policy and the institutions that support macroeconomic policy. And here there's a really interesting message for policymakers anywhere in the world. It's not so much the policy that you put in place, but rather the stability and transparency of that policy. For South African policymakers, perhaps the message is it's not whether there is nationalization or not nationalization, but rather that the policy around state ownership is clearly communicated to the market. And then those policies need to be supported by effective functioning institutions. South Africa here happens to be particularly strong in this element, and I'm thinking of Treasury, the South African Reserve Bank, amongst others. Element 4 and element 5, I think, are pretty self-evident, and they relate to the ability of your single most important ingredient in economic advance being able to work effectively and productively: people. And what people need to be productive is they need access to education, and they need access to healthcare and the support of a functioning healthcare system. So these are elements 4 and 5. Notably, when we say access to healthcare and access to education, this doesn't necessarily imply that everyone is going to Harvard Business School or visiting the Cleveland Clinic, but that they have access to a functioning school system, that with time that education system improves, and that those benefits are fed back into an ever-improving architecture. In the same way, healthcare starts off an effective base and steadily rises. The sixth attribute is openness, that countries that are open tend to have far better gains or achieve far greater advances in socioeconomic welfare. And what we mean by openness is that it is easy for capital to move across borders, for people to move across borders, for goods and services to move across borders, for ideas to move across borders, that you have fiber optic cable landing on your coastline, and that brings in information at fast speed and low cost, and that those speeds improve and costs fall with time. Economies that boast those six attributes, or that are well endowed with those six attributes, historically have done very well. And this is likely to remain the case without qualification. And given that scenario, or given that backdrop, we then paint the world with two scenarios, and we ask, who has these six factors and who is missing these six factors? And it's notable that the advanced world, despite the furious policies that they've put in place over the last 4 or 5 years to help relieve the stress of the global financial crisis, those economies haven't grown over the past 5 years, despite the furious policy, and they haven't grown because they are poor in a number of these important ingredients, most notably savings deficient. The demography is now graying, they've got aging populations, and policy is questionable at best. So what is PAFTOTI? PAFTOTI is a rather pointed and rude acronym that stands for pissing around for 10 or 20 years. And whilst it is pointed and rude, I think it makes the argument very clearly that the advanced world is in trouble because it is missing a number of these important 6 elements. The demography is wrongly shaped, that there are more people going into retirement than coming into the workforce. The economy is savings deficient, and the policies that have been put in place in the advanced world over the last 5 years in the case of the United States and Western Europe have really amounted to nothing, that they have at best just stood still, that furious borrowing, rock bottom interest rates, wild printing of money, the economies are the same size today that they were in 2007. This is the Paftoti scenario, and we borrow it from Japan.